Okay, get ready for a deep dive into a case that's stuck with Australia for decades now. 1977, two young women, Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, murdered in their home at 147 Easy Street in Melbourne.
A case that, despite tons of press and plenty of people under suspicion, remains unsolved.
Yeah, and we've got a lot to go through today. Articles, court documents, even a whole book dedicated to this case. So, listeners, get ready. We're going to break down everything, try to make sense of it all.
It really is like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Right. And it all starts with Suzanne and Sue. Who were they? What were their lives like?
Both originally from a small town called Benalla. They ended up moving to Melbourne,
Hmm.
kind of chasing a bigger life. Close friends, love to cook, travel, that sort of thing.
Sounds like they were really enjoying life.
Yeah, in fact, just got back from a trip together, the Greek islands. Suzanne, she had a little boy, Gregory, just 16 months old at the time.
Man, that just adds another layer of tragedy to this whole thing.
Doesn't it? It's really heartbreaking.
So let's go back to Monday, January 10th, 1977, the last day anyone saw them alive. What was their day like? Just a normal day, or were there any signs, anything that seemed off?
It's eerie. It was a completely ordinary day. Makes the whole thing even more shocking.
Yeah, I bet.
Sue's mom was visiting from Benalla. They went shopping. Later, Sue's brother Martin, he came over for dinner, helped her fix a broken stereo. Left around 9 p.m., last one to see them alive.
And they were just going to settle in for the night, watch some TV. I think they said it was the Sullivans, right?
Yeah, the Sullivans.
Yeah.
Popular show back then, and then.
Yeah.
Well, then everything changed.
3 days go by, nobody hears from them. What happens next? When do things really start to unravel?
Thursday the 13th, Janet, the next-door neighbor, she and her friend Alona, they were out looking for the women's dog, Mishka. Had been missing for a couple of days.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Alona, she went into the house through an open back door, and, well, that's when they found them.
And the crime scene, I've seen the photos. It's pretty horrific. What can you tell us about the details? What did the police find?
It was brutal. The coroner, he determined there were 82 stab wounds in total. 55 on Sue, 27 on Suzanne. Signs of a struggle, especially in the hallway. And there was evidence of a post-mortem assault on Suzanne.
Post-mortem assault? What does that even mean?
It means the attack continued even after she was already dead.
God. And to think, Gregory was there the whole time, alone in his cot.
It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, the violence, the victims, and then this little baby right there in the middle of it all. The killer tried to clean up. Blood-soaked towels were found in the house, even at a nearby playground. But Gregory, they left him completely untouched.
So strange, like some kind of twisted mercy in the midst of all this horror. With a crime this brutal and a child involved, the police must have been under a ton of pressure to find whoever did this. Where did they even begin?
Yeah, the pressure was immense.
Mm.
And right off the bat, they had a few people they were looking at, each one with their own story, their own potential connection to Suzanne and Sue. But the investigation was, well, there were issues from the very beginning.
What kind of issue?
For one, it was all handled by the state homicide squad. They left out the local Collingwood police, the guys who actually knew the area, the people.
Right.
Then there was the crime scene itself. Back then, they weren't as careful about contamination as they are now. And on top of all that, Melbourne had a huge backlog of murders at the time, so resources were stretched thin.
So we've got a complicated crime scene, maybe even messed up evidence, and a police force that's already overloaded. Sounds like the perfect recipe for a case to go cold.
It definitely made things harder for those trying to find the truth. And there were some missed opportunities right from the start.
Missed opportunities? Like what? What are we talking about here?
Well, there were a couple of neighbors who might have heard something important that night. But at first, the police didn't really pay them much attention.
That's frustrating. What could these neighbors have told them? What did they see or hear?
One of them, a woman named Gladys Coventry, she saw a man washing his hands and clothes in the kitchen sink at 147 Easy Street, right around the time the murders happened. But the police, they didn't take her seriously at first.
And by the time they realized she might have seen something important.
Yeah, she wasn't willing to talk anymore.
Wow. So a potential eyewitness just dismissed. Did anyone else come forward with information?
There was another neighbor, Peter Hears. He heard car doors slamming and a car speeding off around 2:30 in the morning. Reported it to the police, but they never even interviewed him.
So we've got potential witnesses being ignored, a crime scene that might have been compromised, and a police force that's already spread too thin. So where did they even begin to look for the killer? Did they have any suspects?
Well, they had suspects.
Yeah.
Every single one of them had some connection to Suzanne and Sue, but some were more likely than others. And we need to understand why these three men in particular were on the police radar.
Okay, I'm ready. Lay it on me. Who were these guys and what made them suspects?
We'll start with Colin Fowler, a tobacco salesman. He actually admitted to going into the house through a window on the night of the murders. Claimed he never saw the bodies, though.
He went into the house through a window the night of the murder.
Yep. Said he'd been dating Sue, got worried when she didn't answer his calls, so he climbed through the window to check her phone number, but never saw the bodies.
That window story. It's a little hard to believe, isn't it? How often were people just climbing through windows back then? Was his behavior truly suspicious? And what about the other suspects? What were their stories?
Another person they looked at was Barry Woodard, Suzanne's boyfriend. He'd been at the house the night before the bodies were found, even left Suzanne a note in the kitchen.
So he was there just hours before.
Yeah. Said he didn't notice anything unusual. But the police were suspicious. He was connected to Suzanne. They couldn't rule out him sneaking out of his sister's where he was staying, going back to 147 Easy Street that night.
Two men with romantic ties to the victims, both at the house shortly before the murders. It's a lot to think about. What about this third suspect?
That would be John Grant, a crime reporter. He was actually staying next door the very night of the murders.
Hold on, a crime reporter? That's a pretty big coincidence, isn't it?
It is, and it gets more interesting. Grant was connected to another unsolved case, the disappearance of Julianne Garcia. He was with her the night she vanished.
A crime reporter present at two different scenes with missing or murdered women. That's definitely suspicious.
Definitely raises some red flags. The police questioned him a lot, but he insisted he was innocent, and they couldn't find any hard evidence tying him to the Easy Street murders.
So we've got Colin Fowler, the tobacco salesman, with a story that doesn't quite add up, Barry Woodard, the boyfriend at the house just before, and John Grant, the crime reporter with a past connected to another missing person case. It's a tangled web.
And then you add in that Suzanne was known to be a bit too trusting. She had some, let's say, unsavory characters in her life, made things even more complicated.
There were even more people the police were looking into.
Oh, yeah. There was even a former police officer got kicked off the force for sexual assault. He was a person of interest, too.
A former officer with a history of assault. Does that make you wonder about how this whole thing was handled initially, especially with all the other problems we've talked about?
It definitely adds another layer to an already messy situation.
Okay, so we've got all these suspects. What about physical evidence? Did anything at the crime scene point to any of these men?
The problem is, back in the late 70s, forensic technology wasn't what it is today. They found semen, bloodstains, even what might have been the murder weapon. But back then, they couldn't definitively connect any of it to the suspects.
So no DNA matches, potentially messed up evidence, and several viable suspects. What happened next?
Well, with all that going on, the case went cold. But that's not the end of the story.
So the case stalls. No answers. But for the families, they're left with this gaping hole. An inquest. No real conclusion. And then, adding insult to injury, Gregory's compensation being denied, really shows you where things were at back then, societal attitudes and all that.
Yeah, you're right. And even though Gregory did eventually get compensation, public pressure, changes in the law, you know how it goes. The families, Suzanne's sister Gail, who ended up raising him, they were left with nothing but questions. Who did it? Why? And those questions lingered for years.
And then, years later, late 90s, new technology, DNA. What did this mean for the case?
It was like a whole new chapter.
Yeah.
Chance to finally get some answers.
It was what everyone was waiting for, right? Science to the rescue.
Exactly. The police had 8 main suspects, including Barry Woodard and John Grant. They all agreed to give blood samples for DNA testing.
So, did it work? Did they find a match? Was it finally over?
It would have been amazing, but no. The results actually ruled out all 8 suspects. It was devastating. So much hope riding on this new technology, and then another dead end.
Can you imagine? After waiting all those years, so that was it, right? Case closed.
Not quite. This is where a new character enters the picture, Peter Collier. He starts sending postcards to the media in 1999, and then letters to Suzanne Armstrong's mother in 2004.
Postcards? From where? A psych ward? That's not your everyday tip. What was he saying?
Collier claimed that another patient at Larundel Psychiatric Hospital, where he was a patient in 77, confessed to the murders.
Wait, so he was in there too in 77?
Yeah, and this other patient, a guy named Anthony Thomas Christie, apparently told a group therapy session that After having sex with women, he felt the need to kill them with a carving knife.
A confession in group therapy. That's a weird place to admit to a double homicide. Why wait so long to tell anyone?
Collier said he was dealing with his own mental health issues back then, couldn't bring himself to say anything. He also felt like the hospital staff should have reported Christie, but they didn't.
It's hard to know what to believe, right? Could be genuine, maybe just delayed. But also, well, people in psychiatric hospitals, their stories, not always reliable. Did the police look into this Christie guy?
They did, but they ended up dismissing Collier, said he had a history of making these kinds of accusations. But here's the thing, Christie did have a criminal record. And if he was the killer, being locked up in a hospital would explain why there weren't any more similar murders in the area after '77.
That's a creepy thought. What happened next? Did anything else come from those claims, or was it just another dead end?
Even with the DNA in Collier's story, the case stayed unsolved. 2017, 40th anniversary of the murders, Victoria police announced a $1 million reward for information. Figured it might be enough to finally get someone to talk.
$1 million? That's huge. Did anyone come forward?
Nope. Despite the attention, the new investigation, the Easy Street murders are still unsolved. They retested the DNA with better technology, interviewed everyone still alive who they considered a suspect, followed every lead, still nothing.
It's crazy to think, all these years later, nobody's been held accountable for such a horrible crime. What about 147 Easy Street itself? What happened to the house?
That's another interesting part of this whole thing. It was empty for 6 years after the murders. People were creeped out by it. It eventually sold, but its history kind of followed it. 2011, a real estate agent actually mentioned the murders in their listing for the house.
Yeah.
It caused a huge uproar.
Wow. Using a tragedy like that to sell a house, that's messed up.
Totally insensitive. People were outraged, sparked a whole debate about what real estate agents should have to tell people, the dark history of a property. The law actually changed after that. Now they have to disclose any violent crimes, whether a buyer asks or not.
So even trying to sell the place, the crime was still there, hanging over it. It's like these things, they don't just disappear, they leave a stain. But with all the twists and turns, it's easy to forget about the human cost of all this. Tell me more about Sue and Suzanne. Who were they? Beyond the headlines.
Sue Bartlett. She was an art teacher, loved by her students. Colleagues said she was larger than life. After she died, a former coworker even raised money to buy a painting in her memory. It's still hanging in the school where she taught.
That's a beautiful way to remember her. What about Suzanne? What do we know about her?
We can get a sense of her personality through letters she wrote while she was traveling. She was adventurous, wanted to see the world. In one letter, she talks about the 2 ways to live life: stay home or go explore. Says, neither is perfect. Happiness comes from within. It's kind of haunting now, knowing what happened to her.
Yeah. Those words hit differently considering her fate. A reminder that she was a real person, thoughts, dreams, a whole life ahead of her. And then there's Gregory, just a baby when his mother was murdered. How has all this affected him?
Gregory was raised by Suzanne's sister, Gail. Grew up knowing this unsolved case was always there. He's talked about the loss, never knowing his mother, the impact it's had on his whole life.
To grow up with that, knowing the person who took your mother might never be found. It's heartbreaking. So we've covered the suspects, the evidence, the things the police missed, how it's affected the community, the families. But the big question remains, who killed Sue and Suzanne?
That's the $1 million question, right? And after all these years, all the investigating, it's still a mystery. The Easy Street murders, it's a reminder that some mysteries might never be solved.
And with so many leads going cold over the years, the chances of finding the truth seem smaller and smaller. What do you think?
But the case is still open. The DNA evidence, even though it's old, it's still there. Maybe with new technology, forensic genealogy, we might actually see this case solved someday.
It's wild, isn't it? All these twists and turns, and we still don't know for sure. Makes you wonder what really happened at 147 Easy Street. Was it like a crime of passion, some random act of violence, or something more planned out,
That's what's so fascinating about this case. It doesn't fit neatly into any one category.
Right.
We've got stuff that points to a personal connection, like the door not being forced open, how brutal it was, the attempt to clean up. But then there are things that make you think it was more spur of the moment, maybe a chance they saw, or just pure rage.
And did they know the women, or was this a stranger?
It's confusing with Suzanne being described as too trusting, having those unsavory characters in her life. Do you think that played a part in what happened?
It's tough to say for sure, but it's definitely something the investigators would have looked at. And it brings up a bigger issue we see in these kinds of cases, blaming the victim.
Yeah, it's messed up to think that someone's past, their personality, could be used to justify what happened to them.
It's important to remember no matter what happened before, Suzanne and Sue were victims of a horrific crime. Focusing on those other things can actually distract us from finding the person who did this, holding them accountable. You're right. This isn't just about solving a puzzle, it's about people, about how broken things can be, how violence can change everything. After going through all this research, do you have any theories? What do you think happened that night? And is there any chance this case could still be solved after all this time?
It's really hard to say for sure. There's evidence that supports a lot of different scenarios.
Yeah.
Could be a jealous ex, someone wanting revenge, or some random act of violence. What I find really unsettling is the idea that the killer might have been locked up in that hospital, like Peter Collier said. Explains why there weren't any similar murders after '77. Makes you think maybe some people are capable of terrible things, but they never get caught because of things beyond their control.
That's a scary thought. But what about the case being solved? It's been over 40 years. Is there even a sliver of hope?
I think there's always hope. DNA technology is always getting better. And like we talked about, forensic genealogy, that could be huge. Maybe one day they'll get a hit a family member and finally close this case.
Fingers crossed. So if anyone out there is listening and they know something, anything about 147 Easy Street.
Doesn't matter how small it seems, could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. That's our deep dive into 147 Easy Street. A case that chills you to the bone, makes you question everything, and reminds us that the search for justice can be a long and winding road. If you're interested in learning more, check out Murder on Easy Street by Helen Thomas. She did a ton of research, goes over everything, even questions how the investigation was handled.
This case, it's a reminder that even in places we think are safe, bad things happen. And finding justice, sometimes it takes a long, long time. But even after all these years, Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, they haven't been forgotten. Their stories stay with us, make us want to understand, to hold people accountable, to never stop looking for the truth.
And that's it for our deep dive into 147 Easy Street. Thanks for listening.